My name is Edgar, and this is Kalam, a podcast about the Middle East.
My name is Shambati, by the way. I'm not giving any interviews to anybody. But you're the exception.
I really appreciate that. I'm really honored that you would give this interview to me, because I know that you haven't been giving, and I know as well I've been chasing Abdullah. So regards to him for that.
Yeah. Okay.
The voice you just heard needs no introduction. I rarely deal in superlatives, but it needs to be said that Dr. Hanan Ashrawi is the most prominent Palestinian politician still alive today. She wasn't just the face of the First Intifada. She represented the very spirit of the uprising itself. She was part of the negotiating team in the early 90s that paved the way for the Oslo Accords. And she was one of the first people from inside Palestinian politics to realize that Oslo was a disaster. She served as Minister of Higher Education and Research in the Palestinian Authority, but has since resigned entirely from the PA for reasons we'll get into during the interview. We'll be getting back to Hanan Ashrawi in just a second, but first, a reminder. I just got back from a trip to Palestine. I spent 10 days living in Ramallah on the occupied West Bank and traveled throughout the West Bank in the State of Israel. The main reason was to video record a series of interviews for Kalam Podcast. In the end, we produced 13 brand new episodes featuring Palestinian artists, rappers, writers, journalists, and even bicyclists, all telling me about what life is like for people living in Palestine and what their thoughts are on the current moment. We'll start releasing this series shortly on YouTube and all podcast platforms, so look out for that. This kind of work isn't easy, and it certainly isn't cheap. If you like what you're hearing on Kalam Podcast and want to support independent journalism on Palestine and the Middle East, please consider signing up to Club Kalam on patreon.com/Kalam Podcast. There, you'll gain access to full-length interviews with all our guests and lots of bonus material for just $3 a month. That's patreon.com/Kalam Podcast. And if you enjoy Kalam Podcast, please subscribe to it and give it a rating on whatever podcast platform you're listening to right now. It helps other people find out about us. Now, on to the show.
And it is not our job to save Netanyahu's position or hide, to be polite, or to save his chances in the elections, or to save his coalition. Nor is it our responsibility to safeguard the security of Israelis. We want to safeguard the security of Palestinians, and a real leadership is that which looks after its own people, gains its legitimacy from its own people, and the best safeguard for everybody involved is a genuine peace. And I believe that the greatest threat to the security of the Palestinians and the Israelis is this Israeli government, Netanyahu and his policies. These are very dangerous times indeed.
This is a clip of Dr. Hanan Ashrawi, it seems incredible to say, from 1997, nearly 30 years ago. Netanyahu clearly was already a menace then. The subject matter is the same. At the time, Dr. Ashrawi was part of the negotiating team involved in the Oslo process, a process which eventually failed. As I mentioned, she was an integral part of the First Intifada, the non-violent Palestinian uprising which forced the Israelis to the negotiating table in the early 90s. If you haven't yet, we'd highly recommend going back to episode 4 of Kalam Podcast to listen to our episode dedicated to the First Intifada featuring the Palestinian academic Islah Jad. Today, we're going to hear from Hanan Ashrawi and her thoughts on what's happening today, given her decades-long experience. So, without further ado, here's Dr. Hanan Ashrawi. Hanan Ashrawi, I don't think you need an introduction, really. I'm so honored and delighted that you would take the time to speak with us today on Kalam Podcast.
It's my pleasure. It's good to talk to you, Edgar.
So, despite the fact that there is a genocide happening in Gaza and there is an immense suffering of the Palestinian people, but many people that I speak to today think that it's actually Israel who's being weakened at this moment. What do you think about that?
Well, actually, the Palestinians are being slaughtered in many ways. Everything is being destroyed. There is no respect for human life or rights or for the past, present, or future. So it's a very critical situation for the Palestinians because Israel is busy, in a sense, completing its agenda, its basic Zionist agenda of 1948. But at the same time, this is the other side of the coin is that for the first time, Israel is being exposed globally. For the first time, there has been a movement in order to hold Israel accountable and to end Israel's impunity. And for the first time, all the incremental flaws and problems of an unaccountable ongoing occupation and land theft and total control and captivity of another people, all these are coming to a head within Israel. So all the contradictions within Israeli society or contradictions between our conflicts between the military wing and the political wing, the ideological differences between the Haredim and the secularists, the ideological differences between people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir and others, along with the secularists. So all these contradictions and conflicts are coming to a head. And Israel's preferential treatment and total lack of accountability are coming to an end because the public opinion throughout the world and the public, in a sense, is seeing what Israel has been doing in the dark.
Yeah. You mentioned the international solidarity movement supporting Palestine, and I definitely want to get back to that in just a second. But if we look at the slaughter that you described it as, the genocide happening in Gaza, do you think that's worse than what happened in 1948?
It's the same ideology. It is worse if you look at the numbers, if you look at the total destruction. But if you look at the fact that there was a deliberate attempt at the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, if you look at the fact that there were a series of massacres in Palestine, if you look at the total destruction and razing of over 500 villages in Palestine, it's the same ethos, it's the same mentality, it's the same approach, modus operandi of attempting to ethnically cleanse Palestine. And of course, to terrorize the Palestinian people, to get them to leave or to expel them and to take over their land. So the fact that this happened without any kind of curbs or accountability allowed the Israelis to think that it can continue. And so they continued with settlements, they continued with home demolitions and destructions, with land theft, with killing people, with the arrests and so on of close to 1 million Palestinians were arrested and so on. So in a sense, that approach, that mentality was allowed to continue, culminating in the genocide now in Gaza, and of course the gradual, deliberate ethnic cleansing of the West Bank.
Yeah.
You cannot say which is better, which is worse. It's the same mentality. It's the same ideology. But now it is happening in plain sight. People know this. They cannot claim ignorance. They cannot say we didn't know. The numbers are there. The names are there. They are still questioning even the numbers.
Yeah.
And the fact that people are recording what they're doing and so on. This is very clear. So it's the epitome, let's say, it's the tail end of the Zionist agenda that began in 1948 or earlier, but its enactment was in 47, 48.
Yeah. So, Dr. Ashrawi, you were a member of the PLO, and you decided to quit about 4 years ago, I think, in 2020. Why did you decide to quit then?
Well, I was a member of the PLO executive, so not the member of the PLO. The PLO has many bodies, including
Sure.
the legislative bodies, the Central Council, and the National Council. And I'm still a member of those, but I quit my executive position, which is the ministerial position.
Mm-hmm.
I did because I saw that the PLO was being sidelined. It was being ignored, that gradually all decision-making was concentrating in the hands of a few, the president and a few people around him. I saw that the PLO was being weakened, even though the PLO is badly needed as an address, as a representative body for all Palestinians everywhere. And I tried to do that, for 10, 12 years I was in the PLO executive, and I tried desperately to reactivate, to revitalize the PLO, but unfortunately there was no political will, there was no attempt in order to revitalize it, in order to give it the status it needs and the respect. And the PA was beginning to take over the tasks of the PLO, given the fact that the PA is not a representative body, is a form of government under occupation for a period of time. It's a temporary setup structure. So I resigned because I felt I don't want to be just a front,
Yeah.
Either we make a difference, either our decisions and our deliberations are respected, or we are just there to be used in order to justify decisions that we did not take. We were not part of the decisions that were taken.
Yeah.
So I just resigned, and I said we need to make room also, because the PLO was becoming really more of a place where older people, the leadership was becoming quite geriatric. And I said, let's make room for the young, for more women, and so on. Unfortunately, when I left, there were no other women, and the people who are there are my age or older even. So it's a shame. It's a shame that the young and women and the diversity of the Palestinian society and public are not being reflected in an inclusive democratic system of the PLO. It still needs to be reformed. It still needs to include all political factions, and it needs to include all generations and genders.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear that because I just came home from a trip to the West Bank, and there most people my age, around 30 years old, refer to themselves as belonging to the Oslo generation, and usually they would curse the Oslo Accords in the same breath. And everything sort of associated with it, which includes, of course, the Palestinian Authority. What has the Oslo Accords meant for Palestinians for the past 30 years?
Well, I don't even want to call them the Oslo Accords. It's a declaration of principles, a DOP that was signed, that was negotiated in Oslo and signed in Washington, and then subsequent agreements. To me, it's a seriously flawed agreement. To most Palestinians, what the Oslo process or the DOP, what that did was, in a sense, entrenched the occupation and gave it power to continue with its policies, and weakened the Palestinians and brought them to live under occupation in a way that would enable Israel to persist in its land theft and its building of settlements, and without any kind of intervention or accountability. So I would say the Oslo process adopted the functional approach rather than the territorial approach. It did not deal with Palestinian sovereignty, it did not deal with the borders, it did not deal with Jerusalem, it did not deal with the cessation of settlements, and with the issue of refugees, which is a core issue. All the core issues were postponed without any guarantees or assurances or accountability or arbitration even. And it gave Israel a free hand to continue to prejudge all these real issues and to take unilateral measures to maintain its occupation and its annexation, while at the same time it weakened the Palestinian side even more so. And there are many flaws we can talk about it. It's not territorial, it's functional, It separated the people from the land. It did not have any kind of accountability or third-party intervention. There were all sorts of serious flaws in that agreement. And unfortunately, when we criticized and talked about these things, they said, no, it's the beginning of an era, but it turns out that the era was worse than the one before, in the sense that the Palestinian leadership came to live under occupation and was seen as doing the bidding of the occupation without the ability to protect its own people, while it was held responsible for the protection of the Israeli settlers and army. So it's a very bizarre system.
Yeah.
Anyway, and that's why now the chickens have come home to roost.
Yeah.
I mean, all the flaws in the agreement are now very clear.
Yeah, I think you put it quite well. It's an extremely bizarre situation when you really look at it, and I think this is not really understood in the West. Another bizarre aspect of all of this is the man himself, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and today he's looking increasingly deranged and unpredictable. And you've been dealing with him for a long time, before his current mandate period as Prime Minister. What kind of person would you say Benjamin Netanyahu is, who he's become such a symbol of evil for so many people around the world?
Yeah. Look, he has always been a person with his own extreme right-wing ideology. He never wanted any real agreement. He always wanted to maintain control over Palestine. He wanted to annex Palestine. He didn't want any sovereignty for the Palestinians. And he wanted to maintain, if he was forced to enter into a negotiating process, he wanted to maintain the process without giving any concessions towards an agreement or any compromises, and continue with his policies of land annexation and killing and so on. So it's not that we are discovering who he is right now. He has been that way for all of his political life. But now it's become very clear that all the things that he's doing, in a sense, have come to a head along with his new fascist partners, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and others, who openly expose this agenda, which is a very lethal agenda. And as you said, it's a deranged agenda, and certainly add to it his own personal egocentric approach. I don't want to say other words, I mean to government, that everything, the government, the party, whatever it is, the country, are all subservient to his own personal agenda, first of all, to avoid going to prison for his corruption and abuse of power and so on, and to stay in power in order to avoid that. And to continue with his annexation agenda and ethnic cleansing and a genocidal approach to Palestine. So it's just that all these things that were not so clearly visible, that he could disguise for a while, but people knew he was a right-wing hardliner and racist. Now it's clear in the open, and it's clear the way he's trying to manipulate everybody and everything, including the Biden administration, including his own coalition and his own party, and including the public in Israel. I mean, it's clear this man is flailing. He is trying to do, in many ways, saying one thing and its opposite at the same time, and playing all sorts of manipulative games in order to stay in power, even at the expense of Israel and the public in Israel and the families of the hostages and so on. So he has lost all credibility, not just locally, but globally. I mean, for a while before that, people and many international leaders were calling him a liar, a chronic liar, and so on. But now it's much worse than that. He's more than that, and it has become very visible. The tragedy is that leaders like Biden and some European leaders are still dealing with him and are still refusing to put any pressure on his lethal, maniacal agenda, and are trying to shield him from any kind of accountability. Look at the Brits, appealing to the court not to issue an arrest warrant, using all sorts of ridiculous excuses, including the Oslo Agreement, which doesn't exist anymore. So that is what is astounding to me, is that leadership in the West, not all of them, but most Western leaders, are still falling all over themselves, trying to rescue him from his own irresponsible and dangerous actions.
Yeah, one of the more, the dangerous actions are clear with this mass slaughter in Gaza, but one of the more deranged things that he said this year was when he went out of his way to speak about the U.S. student movement, and he called the encampment movement in the United States anti-Semitic, and compared it to the Nazis, when in fact Jewish students are overrepresented in all of these movements in proportion to their total share of the population, of the United States.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is one way in which he's trying to implicate all Jews everywhere with his own extremist Zionist agenda.
Yeah.
And there are Jewish, not just students, but all sorts of groups that have existed for a long time, organizations who totally disagree with him and with the Zionist agenda, and who have been very active, but attempting to slander and label anybody who in any way speaks on behalf of Palestine or who criticizes Israel, to label them as anti-Semitic, including the Jewish freedom movement, is somewhere in which he's trying to silence criticism. And he uses this, the Holocaust, the anti-Semitism, and so on, in order to claim that they are beyond reproach, that they have freedom to do whatever they want, and anybody who's critical is anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish and anti-Israel and so on. So I think it's become very obvious. It's become very clear to people that these accusations are not only unfounded, but they are ridiculous.
Yeah.
Starting to, attack Jewish students, Jewish groups, freedom movements, and so on as being anti-Semitic is absolutely unacceptable.
Yeah, it's nuts. What do you feel like when you see these kind of encampment movements, which have spread, far beyond the United States? They're even in Sweden and France and all over the world.
Yeah, to us, it's a source of encouragement. It's a one ray of hope in a very, very dark era. And we are all traumatized. I kept saying all Palestinians, whether in the West Bank, Jerusalem, or in Gaza, or in exile all over the world, everybody is traumatized. And we see this as a very dark era in our history, where we are unable to stop this genocide, the killing of children and women and innocents and innocent men and so on. This is very painful, very painful. There are no words to describe it. It's beyond logic. It's beyond any conscience. And to see that there are people and younger people, and it's not just the students, there were faculty with them, and there were people of conscience everywhere who stood up and who defied their own governments and their own administrations to say this is wrong and we don't want to be complicit, and to demand that their own institutions divest from Israel and stop supporting genocide and so on. So it is the first time in our history in which there are people who have the courage to defy slander, to defy threats of violence, to defy even going to prison and arrests and so on, in order to stand up for what they believe in. And to us, the fact that they are speaking on behalf of Palestine is a ray of hope. It's a breath of fresh air. It's sunshine for us in this darkness. And what makes it even more effective is the fact that they are defying their governments and the powers that be, who have been in many ways bought and paid for by the pro-Israel lobby. And it's quite encouraging. And these are the people who will ultimately be the decision makers in these countries. And they will not be silenced. And They will not be intimidated. And I think mainstream media and especially in the States, I don't want to say that in Europe also they are all bought and paid for, but also in the States, where they will refuse to maintain the same way in which elections take place and the funding takes place and so on, that there will be elections based on principle, and people will be held accountable based on what their positions are vis-a-vis Palestine and other areas of unequal and unfair and painful and unjust conflict. In Europe also you have, despite the rise of the right in many different places, the younger generation is still speaking out, and the students. The encampment movement is one which became very visible and so on because they took clear actions to change reality, which is, in a sense, a message to the leaders that the leadership should take action to change reality, should divest from Israel, should stop sending weapons and munitions to Israel, should stop sending money to Israel or engaging in any kind of interaction with Israel. These are things that will make a difference. That will. Right now, people sometimes question and they say they haven't changed. Of course, change is not overnight unless you have a coup d'etat, but change is incremental. It takes time. And the gap between, the time lag between public opinion and decision making is very clear.
Yeah.
But I think it will be effective in time, and we will see a change in decision making as well.
I think a lot of people my age and both inside and outside Palestine look back at the era of the First Intifada with a kind of like mythical gaze. You know, it seems like it's almost like it was a fairy tale. I think, you know, considering how much, I mean, there was a brutal crackdown, of course, but there was still some kind of hope, and it was such an innovative movement. And you obviously played a huge role in that. What lessons do you draw, and how do you, when you think about that era in this current moment, how do you relate to it?
Yeah, I mean, when you mentioned the First Intifada, I'm sure you know, all of us in my generation look back at it with a sense of nostalgia and maybe, as you said, a sort of mythical sense of longing and appreciation that we as a people, men, women, children, everybody joined together regardless of age, political affiliation, any kind of affiliation, and we had with one goal to end this occupation, to defy the brutal Israeli military occupation. We were unarmed, and we used, you know, methods like building barricades to stop the army from coming, like throwing stones. And of course, they said, you're all terrorists if you throw a stone. Imagine a soldier wearing helmets and bulletproof vests and carrying machine guns and so on, being threatened by a small stone thrown by a kid or a woman. But anyway, and we used means of self-empowerment. we had built neighborhood committees and popular committees, and they closed down our schools, so we were teaching in popular schools illegally in our homes, in our gardens, in abandoned places, and so on. They tried to force us to open and so on, so we closed down the shops. But ultimately, it was a battle of wills, let me put it that way. And it was a clear message to the world. We were nonviolent. We were a people under occupation facing a very violent and lethal occupation army with one clear message: we want to be free. We deserved our freedom. We deserve our sovereignty. And so in many ways it sent a message that was extremely moral, I think, and invigorating and hopeful, that when a people want to live and want to live in dignity and freedom on their land, they are willing to take measures and steps to expose the brutality and the illegality and immorality of the occupation and to assert their own human values. So we won the higher moral ground.
Yeah.
And we created a system of solidarity and a system of family symbiosis and a system of mutual support for each other. And we showed that we were not afraid. I wrote this in the Madrid speech. If you read it again, the fact that we dared to stand up, we know the occupation and what it means, and we defied it. So that was very important. And that brought attention to the Palestinian cause. When people saw the army breaking the bones of Palestinian boys and children, when they saw them shooting at unarmed families, men, women, children, demonstrating and facing the army and so on, people began to question.
Yeah.
This is not a moral army. This is not a normal situation. And when we asserted our right to live, to build institutions, they closed down our universities, all of them. We taught. They used to come to our house searching for incriminating evidence. If we had blackboard or if we had books or if we had, So they made teaching and studying illegal. They made solidarity illegal. My daughters used to go to a neighborhood school when they closed down their schools, and they pursued them. The army running after 6-year-old kids and 7-year-old kids because they were doing something so dangerous as going to a neighborhood school. Anyway, so it was a different era. And we were optimistic because we thought we could change. We thought once the world knows the reality, the brutality of the occupation and the nature of the Palestinian movement, that they would intervene, that they would, in a sense, act on the side of justice. That's why when we went to Madrid, we were hopeful. I called it an age of optimism, but also maybe an age of naivete, because we didn't understand the fullness of the evil of which Israel is capable, and we didn't understand the depth of depravity and complicity with Israel.
A lot of people are starting to speak about the day after, when there is a Palestinian state and when the Zionist project comes to an end. And this might also be a bit naive, but if we were to ponder a little bit, is there like a political class in Palestine that you believe is ready to take the reins of the state?
There are many people who are thinking about this. There are many different movements and so on. And people are beginning to think about that. What is a day after? A day after what? That's what I keep telling people. The whole world wants to find ways in which they can govern and control Gaza and maintain Israel's security. And I don't see the day after as the end of Zionism, yet. It's not happening. Everybody is trying to accommodate Israel and Israel's security. To us, of course, we want a system of governance. We want a democracy. We want to be able to have a governance that is capable of bringing security and peace and sovereignty and so on. And there are different movements. There are different organizations. I've attended many different meetings in which people are talking about, if not the day after, but what is the best form of organization, political and social and economic? What are the different ways in which we can intervene in this reality and bring some relief and reconstruction to Palestine? And I'm not going to say there is one that's better than the other, but I'm telling you the Palestinian people are alive and they are struggling and they are trying to find the most proper way of doing it, but certainly it has to be Palestinian.
Yeah.
It cannot be at the diktat of Israel or even the Arab countries or the West or people who are trying to reorganize the way they did in 1947, or if you want to go back to Versailles and the division of the whole region and the creation of different countries and so on. No, it is time for the Palestinians to genuinely exercise their right to self-determination. Nobody should determine our lives or our futures except the Palestinians themselves.
Yeah.
And there are different approaches. Some people want one state. Some people want, a two-state solution as a temporary solution. Some people see neither one being available right now. But let's try to maintain Palestinian resilience and their ability to stay on the land, because this is what Israel wants: to carry out ethnic cleansing and to expel the Palestinians. So it's a very difficult situation. But whatever happens, it's the Palestinians who have to govern themselves. And I think we have a younger generation that has to be empowered, both young men and women who have to be part of this system. We cannot continue with the same old slogans and cliches of the past.
Yeah. Dr. Ashrawi, I've taken up far too much of your time, and I really appreciate it. I just thought I'd ask you a last question about... You've been doing this for a long time. You've been a negotiator, a political activist, a politician, and an educator, many different things. What is your biggest lesson, looking back from the several decades that you've been active, especially considering this abyss that we're in right now?
Wow, that's a very difficult question, because I don't know if I have drawn the proper conclusions yet, or if I have really gleaned the messages and the lesson I need to glean. All I know is that in many ways, as I said, we were naive. We felt that there could be some form of justice for Palestine throughout different phases in history, but all of us failed to understand the cruelty of the Western system, of Zionism, of the fact that there are not just double standards, but outright racism, and that there is superiority of one race over the other, that the North thinks of itself as being the heir in many ways of the colonial system, white supremacy and so on, the North-South divide. So it's a much more complex reality, and that justice alone is not enough, and that being the nice guy doesn't get you anywhere, and that the manipulative system of the settler colonial system with its Western allies is one that knows no law, no justice, no human rights. And the Palestinians are dismissed or treated as either non-human beings or non-first-class human beings. So it's a very tough lesson, and it's a very painful lesson, because I cannot take it when I see daily children being torn apart, total families being destroyed, all the infrastructure. And when I see in the West Bank what is happening as well, it's incredible. I don't see how any person of conscience could sit back and not just do nothing, but defend this genocide and slaughter and massacres and so on. So I'm still in the process of learning that there are people capable of doing that and defending that publicly and taking decisions and still supplying Israel with weapons and ammunition and so on. And of course, protecting it from global accountability, including at the ICC and ICJ. It's unconscionable. So it's, again, it's a difficult and painful period, and maybe I need some time after the trauma to be able to think much more calmly and see where we can go from here. But I think all the myths, all the deceptions of a world order, a global rule of law, blah, 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 all these have been exposed as being part of a racist system that does not treat people equally and that views maybe white supremacy as being the superior form of value and worth, and non-whites do not deserve equal value or worth. This is one thing. But other things, there are more complex geopolitical systems. There's the North-South divide, there's the East-West divide. And we have to understand that if we want to live within this world, we should be able to debunk myths and to have the courage to stand up to them and to maintain our allegiance to our own people and our own cause. We do have, of course, people who are standing in solidarity, people who are willing to pay the price with us. And this, as I said earlier, is a source of encouragement. This is one thing that gives us all hope that we are not alone, even though the global system is unjust and with multiple standards.
Yeah, I can attest to that. You're certainly not alone, despite this awful and genocidal time that we're living through.
True.
Dr. Ashrawi, I'm so grateful that you took the time to speak with us today on Kalam Podcast.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's good to talk to you, if pleasure is the appropriate word.
Yeah.
But I'm glad we had the opportunity to talk.
Thank you so much. That was Dr. Hanan Ashrawi and the 18th episode of Kalam Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did and would like to support us materially, you can do so by signing up at patreon.com/Kalam Podcast. For just $3 a month, you'll gain access to full-length interviews with all our guests and lots of bonus material. That's at patreon.com/Kalam Podcast. And for continuous updates, follow us on Instagram at Kalam Podcast. For now, that's all from us. Peace. Kalam was written and hosted by me, Edgar Mannheimer. Research and production by Sam Karl Samra. Poetry reading in Arabic by Khulud Saghir. And sound design by Arthur Mannheimer.